There you go.
Morning all. Morning to those joining us.
Morning.
Hi Sarah, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. So how are you?
Yeah, very well. I haven't seen you in ages, it feels like.
No, it's been busy.
Yeah, absolutely. Morning Steve, how are you?
Morning, Alistair. I'm well, thank you.
Good, good.
Still in
Morning,
the
David,
corridor.
again.
Still in the corridor, I see.
In the potting shed, yeah, absolutely in the we'll call it the garden office. Morning Natalie. Mark, I think you can probably hear us.
Indeed, I can.
There he is. Hi Mark.
Hi.
Hi Mark, David.
Hi everyone.
Steve, I'm trying to work out the last time I saw you. Was it in Yeovil for that Bank of England panel? That must have been a good couple of years ago.
I couldn't possibly remember. It may have been. It may have been, yes. A lot of things have happened since then.
Just a couple, eh?
Yeah.
New glasses?
Yes.
Yeah.
My wife wanted me to look more like Jurgen Klopp.
Has she succeeded?
But only in the glasses department.
As long as you don't start speaking in a German accent, you'll be fine. Right, we'll just give it a couple of minutes for others to arrive. How's everyone? Steve, you're in the office, are you?
Yes. So in actual fact, I've been in the office pretty much all the way through because one of the consequences of having about 700 people on the shop floor is that you know, there's other things which go on around which need people present. So I was part of the team looking after the things that couldn't always be done from home.
Yeah. And what's the plan? Is everyone going to be coming back full time, office wise?
Eventually, but there will be a lot more working from home than was happening 2 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Okay. Cousin Steve.
Yeah. Good morning, Tim.
Tim, I think you're muted and your camera's off, so we got your message. But I take it you are actually related, didn't I?
We're cousins.
Are you? Right. Well, I think we'll make a start. There may be others that join as we go through. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Alistair Tudor. I'm the Operations Manager at Somerset Chamber of Commerce. We're here, obviously, it's a manufacturing engineering forum, so we've got a general discussion as well, and certainly on what your thoughts and any feedback that you've got that we can take to the BCC centrally to feedback on what's going on out there in business land, so that Westminster can get a feel for it. We do have a presentation from Chris Barrett from Auditel around carbon neutrality and what we should all be doing. We're all aware that carbon neutrality is a topic that is both hot with a stick and with a carrot, the stick of legislation and the carrot of customer demand. And we've got the date of 2050 in the diary. There's a lot to be done. It feels like it's a long way away, but I do remember where I was just about in 1992. So it is within reach. So we'll come to Chris shortly to get his thoughts and guidance on that. But what I'm quickly going to do is run around the room and just ask everybody to introduce themselves quickly, so that we know who's in the room. So I'm going to start with Chris. I'll start with you if that's all right.
Yeah, Chris Barrett, Auditel affiliate. I am here to do this presentation with my colleagues, David and Mark, who'll introduce themselves. I have over 20 years in the energy supply industry, generally just consider myself an energy expert.
Excellent, thank you. Sarah, morning.
Good morning, everybody. Sarah Duff from Smart Manufacture. So we specialise in helping small manufacturing companies get end-to-end visibility across their manufacturing operations, so driving improved efficiency and productivity through a range of cloud-based software platforms.
Great, thank you. David, morning.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. David McDonald, colleague Chris's. I have spent the best part of my career, over 30 years now, working in energy, principally renewable energy, principally large-scale generation, but in recent years moving to more towards sustainability. I'm a former Director of Sustainable Development with Unite Group, which is the UK's largest developer and operator of student accommodation. So lots of challenges in bringing that agenda to life for our customer base then. Working with Auditel on the carbon agenda, really. So carbon, as you've said, is becoming an increasingly important aspect or consideration at a strategic level for many, many businesses around the UK, and it's only becoming increasingly thus. So I look forward to Chris's leading the presentation this morning.
Excellent, thank you. Natalie.
Hi, I'm Natalie Beecham. I am the project lead for the Hinkley supply chain. So we help matchmake local and regional businesses with tier 1 requirements on site at Hinkley Point.
Thanks, Natalie. Mark, morning.
Unmute, Mark.
Yep. I was very aware that I was on mute until the split second before you called my name. No, I'm also I'm a colleague of Chris and David. I've worked in sustainability and the whole carbon neutral climate change area in business, I would say, for about 25 years now. I'm an engineer by, well, actually an aircraft engineer by training and inclination, but for 25 years it's been pretty much the leading edge of sustainability, and certainly carbon neutral, carbon accounting and that kind of thing. So that's me briefly.
Thanks, Mark. Steve.
Good morning all. Steve Whitlock, I'm a director at Pneumatic International Limited in charge. We are a manufacturer of cleaning equipment, primarily small vacuum cleaners, but other cleaning equipment as well.
Lovely, thanks, Steve. Tim hasn't got a camera or microphone today, but he is on the call. So Tim Walrond is from Taunton Fabrications. Laura, just quickly introduce yourself.
Yep, so I think I've met most people on the call. Laura Percival from Somerset Chamber, all things events.
Okay, so Laura will be running the presentation for Chris. So I'm gonna hand over to Chris. Chris is going to speak for about 20 minutes. We'll have some time for Q&A and then also general conversation as well, because there's an awful lot going on within manufacturing engineering at the moment. I think we all appreciate the pressures on supply chain, raw materials, workforces, pandemics, etc. So we'll come to that afterwards. I'm going to hand over to Chris. Chris, over to you.
Thank you. First slide. Here we go. Thank you. Okay, this is carbon management oversight for you all. I don't know exactly where you all are on your journeys towards carbon neutrality. Hopefully you will learn a few things from this, or at least we will have time at the end for discussion. I know we are under time pressure. This is a general meeting on manufacturing. You'll have other things that Alistair wants to discuss at the end. So I will crack on to the next slide. So Auditel are procurement and supply chain specialists. We're born from a background of cost management, helping businesses reduce their costs, and either via finding better ways of doing things, cheaper ways of doing things, or reducing costs through outsourcing of that service within businesses. We have experience across a whole range of sectors and areas, and today you've got myself and David and Mark are experts, particularly around the energy side of things. And our role in monitoring and tracking businesses' costs, particularly around energy, puts us in a particularly good position to help businesses understand their carbon impact or the climate change impact and help them manage that, which is why we believe we are a good fit for this kind of activity. Next slide, please. So we have a specialist group. There are about 100 consultants across the country operating across a range of areas, but there's a group of specifically in this area. We've got ESOS lead assessors. Mark, who you've got on the call today, is a lead verifier. We are heavily involved in waste management, energy procurement of any kind, whether that be renewable energy or not, and as mentioned, carbon reporting and verification. So a well-qualified team of people to help our clients in this area. Next slide, please. So as we go through the journey that I want to take you on, just some thoughts for you to be bearing in mind, and we can discuss this at the end really, which is, you know, have you already got carbon management strategies? I'm pretty sure that Pneumatic will already be well down this path because they've always been very proactive in this area. You know, but people will be on different parts of this journey. Some people will be looking at it. Some people will already be well advanced. You know, have you set up climate change commitments? You know, have you got environmental statements already set up? Have you measured your carbon footprint? If you're a big customer like Pneumatic, you will have to do that as part of SECR, which will give you your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, which I'm going to talk about in a second. However, a lot of customers don't have the incentive to do that because it's not forced upon them, despite being a good starting point for them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But even if you are not under some kind of regulatory pressure, you may be coming under pressure to report on your emissions as part of your all-round business, which is particularly when you're going to tender and from other people in your stakeholder community. Next slide, please. So you'll all be aware that the world has changed, particularly in the manufacturing sector, where Brexit has been and continues to be a big factor as we start to unpick the consequences of that, and people who are importing and exporting, you know, are facing still a lot of unknowns as to how to get through that journey. It's adding a lot of cost to business, and of course, we're all aware that the COVID-19 pandemic has hit us in the last year and a half, completely unforeseen. And I think this illustrates, in particular, that risk in our world is increasing massively. And it's not likely to change. And businesses that don't take into account the likely risks are going to struggle in the future. And climate change is one of those risks, because it's not just about whether or not your activities are impacting the climate, it's whether the climate change will impact your business, often misunderstood and not looked at by organisations. But when it affects things like the arrival of goods into your business because ships are stuck at sea because of bad weather, and that affects certainly energy prices, then we need to start to understand the consequences of these climate changes and other risks that we're facing up to. And in this last year alone, we've seen people like we've seen the G7 meeting making significant commitments, and sovereign governments around the world making significant commitments, such as America doing a bit of a U-turn on the whole climate change piece. And we're seeing evolving legislation and regulation, which is coming out almost daily. And there are so many of these things that are impacting us, particularly for a manufacturing section, you know, things like packaging obligations, which are changing all the time as well. So even though the deadline for kind of get yourself carbon neutral in theory is 2050, there's a lot happening that will drive you towards that changing before then. Okay, next slide, please. So just to kind of go through this, and once again, apologies to those who know this already. I think if you click one more slide, there'll be a build there, Laura. So we're going to talk about what net zero is, just to make sure that we all understand what it actually means. Next slide. Whether it will affect you. Obviously, leave that up for you to be thinking about as we go through the presentation. And finally, what it is that you may want to be doing about this. Now, all sorts of organisations are coming out with declarations about net zero. We see it in the news daily. I certainly do. Lots of commitments going out there. And we've seen, obviously, the government making a total commitment to say that the UK will be net zero by 2050. It's a ubiquitous phrase that we're all using all the time now, but you really need to understand how it really affects you and what you need to do about getting there, and understanding the risk and the pressure that are coming your way so that you can be prepared for it. What I can say is that organisations that have already taken steps in this direction are proving to be more resilient in the face of the changes that are impacting us, because the sorts of things they're doing to prepare themselves for carbon neutrality is preparing themselves for many other different kinds of risks, and they are more likely to survive in the longer term than those businesses that look at the short term and do not. Next slide. So, what is net zero? So there's kind of two ways of looking at this, and the current way that most people are focusing on is the one that's more immediate to them. So in this chart here, you can see that we've got three big arrows. Scope 1, which I'm sure Steve will be well aware of, is about your direct impacts on the environment, and that can be easily measured because you know how many litres of fuel your business uses, and you understand how much oil you might be burning if you're burning oil to keep your properties warm. Scope 2 is the same kind of thing, but it's more to do with indirect emissions. So this is measured at your meter. So this is the import of electricity and gas to do the things that you need to do. So those are all quite easy to measure in some ways. There are conversion factors that will tell you how much of those fuel sources and impacts you're using generate in terms of tons of carbon and other greenhouse gases, and you'll see that those are layered up at the top of that. And that has been a primary focus for people at the moment, because that is the requirement for SECR, which is the streamlined emissions streamlined carbon emissions reporting requirement on bigger organisations, which says you've got to put this figure of carbon in your financial statements. So a commitment to organisations to make them start to measure these things and start to declare it in the public interests. However, the big picture really involves these scope 3s, and this is a much more complex area. And when you start looking at scope 3, you're looking at the impacts or the carbon emissions of all the other services and supplies that you are using. So ones that you do not directly influence or control. So goods that you buy in, the actions of other organisations of those goods, all adding up, and you don't have visibility of those things, or not easily. And yet, in reality, if you're going to do true calculation of your carbon footprint, you need to understand that. So probably the best way of illustrating that is to look at the next slide, which is Microsoft's commitment. Now, as you can see on this slide, the blue line are Microsoft's and their supply chain's carbon emissions. Now, Microsoft has said we want to be carbon negative by 2030, so not just breaking even, they want to actually be a negative carbon emitter. And as you can see on that graph, they've got a black line showing how they're going to get there. And at the bottom of that, you can see how they're intending to try to deliver that. Now, the bulk of their carbon emissions are not their own carbon emissions, not ones that they control. As you can see there in their Microsoft operational carbon emissions. So they're going to be looking to try to drive carbon out of their supply chain in order to achieve that neutrality. Now, there'll be a degree that they cannot achieve, And traditionally that is being looked at as being delivered through carbon offsets. And you will have heard people talking about carbon offsets, saying, well, you know, we're net zero because we bought a load of offsets. Well, the thing is about offsets is that, yes, they are a temporary fix to your carbon emissions issue, but in the standards that are like to become the standards, and some people might have heard of PAS 2060, carbon offsets are only allowable for 1 year. So carbon offsets are not the solution, and carbon offsets also, if everyone in the world wanted to offset their carbon emissions, there just aren't enough carbon offsets in the world to do it that way. So carbon removal becomes a bigger factor, and this is where carbon is actively removed from the environment, and that's the way they are seeking to achieve their gain. Now, I put this up just because I think it's a great illustration of the sort of thinking that businesses needed to make. And we're seeing a lot of people announcing that they're going to be carbon neutral by a certain year. But the question is, do they mean just on their own direct and immediately indirect emissions, scope 1 or 2s, or are they talking about the full scope 3 emissions as well? And if they are doing that and they want to guarantee or prove that they have done that, then we'll need to do that to a standard, and that standard will need to be verified by a credible verifier such as Mark Miller on the call today. Otherwise, there's going to be accusations, quite rightly, of the risk of greenwashing. I'm guessing you've all heard of the term greenwash, and we see a lot of it in the media at the moment, where organisations announce that they're doing all these wonderful things and they're buying offsets or they're investing in this, that and the other. Creates great PR and helps them perhaps be, you know, in their marketing effort, but sometimes what they're doing is not actually really that helpful. A good classic example of that is the buying of renewable energy. Renewable energy is available at relatively little premium at the moment, and one of the reasons why that is the energy is generated anyway. Buying it as renewable does give you a carbon offset in terms of your bills for the moment, but there are a lot of naysayers out there saying that it shouldn't do, and if that gets pulled, a lot of businesses will be stuck with a lot of renewable energy that's not giving them the benefit that they were expecting. So this is just an illustration of the way that things can go, but each organisation, we would argue, needs to start putting together their thinking about how they're going to achieve that kind of pathway or roadmap towards carbon neutrality based on their own specific capabilities and requirements. And it's all going to be different. Like I say, some businesses might be able to control things with low-hanging fruit, and other people might be reliant on technology that isn't even there yet. But to understand that at least gives them a position to start doing things with. Next slide, please. So one of the key questions for you to start thinking about is, you know, does it affect you and how does it affect you? As you say, you might be being affected by regulatory pressures. So packaging controls that are on their way through could catch you out if you haven't started thinking about that. It could increase your costs because you're required to cater for the downstream costs of recycling the materials that you're sending out to your customers. It might be commercial pressures. So this might be about financing. So we're seeing increasingly tighter restrictions applying to financing organisations, the kind of businesses that invest in organisations, to make sure that they are doing due diligence on what they're investing in. And this is really important because if you can get cheaper financing because you're doing all the right things and can demonstrate that, that is a really critical part of running any business. Whereas if your competitors are doing that and you are not, and they're getting cheaper financing, that gives them a significant competitive edge. And we're seeing more and more ethical purchasing funds out there who are specialised in these areas, but also we are seeing just the normal run-of-the-mill financiers increasingly asking for this kind of information as part of their investment assessments. Customer perceptions, you'll all be aware of that. You know, it's what we see in the media all the time at the moment. You know, people advertising, you know, we're renewable, we're green, we're environmentally friendly, etc. How true that is sometimes debatable. But the fact is, pressure is growing from the customer to start expecting their suppliers, their services to demonstrate the right kind of behaviours. And then probably the most important one, which is the one that I've already covered off really, which is supply chain pressure. And that can manifest itself particularly around tenders, where increasingly we'll begin to see in tender requirements the need to demonstrate what you're doing about climate change, how you are managing it, what your carbon footprint is. And when we look at carbon footprint, we're not necessarily looking at the actual physical tons that you emit. It will be done on an intensity metric, and that intensity metric is the tons per maybe widget that you produce or turnover or that kind of thing, so that they can measure you against another supplier. And that will become increasingly important because they will need to be able to demonstrate this down their supply chain as well. So you need to be thinking about that, and if you haven't thought about that, then I would recommend you start doing that. Next slide, please. So the rather unfortunately named roadmap, I always think pathway might be a better one, because roadmap suggests some kind of emissions already if we're using roads. This is going to be too small for you to read on the side, but one of the reasons why it's there is just to demonstrate that the journey is an iterative process. It isn't something you can do as a one-off piece now, put a strategy together, put your plan together, start delivering it, and that's it. Because things change, regulations change, your own business changes, crises will occur, and therefore what will happen is you need to constantly measure and monitor and review where you're at through this journey to make sure that you are adapting as you go along to deliver your ambitions. Your ambitions may change. You may find that actually you're doing very well, and you can improve your aspirations. You may need to improve your aspirations because pressure is coming from the market for you to do so. Alternative, you might find new technologies are coming that can help you. So all the things there on that in the tip box you can read yourselves are all factors that are involved in this. But I think the main takeaway from this slide for me is that just remember, this is a journey from A to B, and B will move, and to be able to, for you to do that, you've got to be constantly monitoring and monitoring, targeting, and reviewing all the time to make sure you're on track and to make sure you're adapting to the changes in the environment that you're operating within. Next slide. So I've put together a few tips, which it'll be interesting for you to perhaps give views on afterwards, but these are just my thoughts about what things you might be doing in the manufacturing world. First of all, if you aren't already measuring and identifying what things need attention, then you really should be doing that. That's not just a carbon or climate change related issue, that's just good business practice, and we know from our own experiences that a lot of businesses still are not doing this very well. In doing that, you might be able to identify some really low-hanging fruit. Once again, not all businesses do this, and we identify regularly through our energy monitoring situations where we can see that people are not setting their controls properly, behaviours are going on that are unidentified. Things being left on overnight, things being left on during the weekend, uncontrolled. So there are things you can be doing to try to manage that. If you haven't changed your lights to LED lighting already, then that really is something you should be moving to. It's not going to be the full answer, but there are lots of other things you might be wanting to consider. If you've got a high transport emission impact, then there are things you can be considering. It isn't quite satisfactory to say, well, we can't do anything about it because the technology isn't there, hydrogen isn't there, etc. There are a growing number of electric vehicle suppliers up to a fairly large size vehicles, certainly for local deliveries, and even I've seen waste management trucks being developed by Renault. But also you can buy hydrogenated vegetable oil. It is at a premium. But that is a diesel equivalent, and it can be put into a diesel engine. So, these are things that you can be doing if you want to demonstrate that you are taking action. And we've seen recently, I saw a presentation by a guy who's gone net zero already, and he outsourced a lot of his delivery activities. He basically closed down his own transport fleet and outsourced it to multiple drop deliverers because that was far more energy efficient than running his own fleet. It was a gut-wrenching decision for him because he lost all his liveried vans and all those kinds of things, but it's made a big impact on his sustainability and his carbon emissions, and it's improved his carbon footprint and the ability he has to promote that to his customer base, and that has worked out for him. Heating and cooling, an age-old problem for many organisations and a cost for many organisations, particularly when you've got big spaces to heat. Are you looking at the age of the equipment? Are you looking at the technology that you're using? Can that technology be improved? Can the controls be managed? And then moving on to slightly more arcane areas where people like David McDonald get involved, which is around capital projects. And there's lots of things that people could be doing around on-site generation, whether that be solar panels or whether it be lighting or other building infrastructure projects and CHP. But quite often they're avoided because people think it's a cost and therefore I don't want to make a decision and we don't want to do these things. But once again, whilst it is a cost, the cost of financing these projects is incredibly low at the moment because they are almost a guaranteed return. Therefore, you can get cheap finance or you might be able to even get grants. And the long-term business case for these things always looks good. It's just a mindset thing to get over. And once again, pointing to Steve, I know that they have already done a lot of work there with the solar panels, and certainly looking at batteries, Steve, a little bit. I don't know how far you got down that route, but you were having a good look at battery technology on site as well. And then obviously the various specialist things you could do, particularly if you're using a lot of things like compressed energy. There are efficiencies in there that you may not have investigated, not bothered looking at too much, where you can look at. So next slide, please. So in terms of kind of our recommendations for next steps, I suppose the first question is if you haven't already got a carbon management strategy, do you want to develop one? And my recommendation will be yes, because why wouldn't you? Not get caught with your pants down later on when it's too late. I think it's really important to identify who your key stakeholders are. Who are you trying to please here? It may well be just an internal stakeholder. It may be that the CEO reads a Sunday supplement, or his kids get on his back and he thinks, you know what, I think I agree with this. I'm going to get on the case. And that I've seen that happen quite a lot, where people have seen Thunberg and the programs on TV over a weekend and have come away with a moral conscience and suddenly decided they're going to do things. But it might be regulatory pressure and it could be supply chain pressure. But so long as you understand who your stakeholders are, you could be particularly vulnerable if you perhaps have one major customer and that customer has a big shift in attitude towards this and you have not responded to that quickly. You could suddenly find that customer moving away to another supplier that is doing if you're not careful. So you need to be aware of those things, talking to your suppliers and to your customers and finding out what their direction of movement is. Next step is obviously to undertake a scoping survey to try and find out what things you should be doing or can be doing to help reduce your emissions, and determining what the next steps are in terms of delivering that, whether you want to undertake some kind of capital investment or whether it's things you can do on an ongoing basis, or whether you're going to hold off and bear the risk that you can adapt later on in time. So it's all about risk management as far as I'm concerned here. It's important also to identify what your statutory reporting requirements are going to be going forward. At the moment, a lot of what we do is voluntary, apart from larger organisations, but those reporting requirements will be cascaded down and will be increased on smaller and smaller businesses over time. You can guarantee it. So if you think you're under the radar at the moment, that is unlikely to happen in the next 10 or even 5 years, I would suggest. Next slide. Okay, just pretty much wrapping up there now. Just to say that Auditel, as I said, we believe we're in a great position with our existing customers to help them because we have a close view of what they're doing already and have a lot of the information to hand and are already helping them in some of these areas. What we'd like to offer is we can host a workshop for your senior leadership team to help basically kick this around and try and find out what the pressures are, what things you can be doing, have a general discussion and maybe help you start to draft out a plan. And our objective in that kind of workshop will be to convey a clear understanding of the risks and opportunities that are going to arise for you, and the reasons why you should be adopting an effective carbon management strategy. Next slide. Any questions? I think I just caught that to 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more. Sorry, Alistair.
Not at all. Actually, it's fascinating to see, you know, all the different elements that go into this. So thank you, really enlightening. I guess it's really interesting to see the pressure that's kind of going to come from supply chain, and I'm looking particularly at Sarah, because obviously you speak to quite a lot of different manufacturing firms. Are you seeing pressure on businesses with their supply chains already in terms of starting conversations like this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sort of part of two sort of collaboration initiatives, both sort of spun up, you know, when COVID first broke out, in terms of the whole sort of reshoring and getting suppliers and manufacturers to work sort of closer together. So I think I'm certainly seeing that. I was also going to mention a company, I don't know if the guys from Auditel know this company, called Crystal Doors. They're based near Rochdale. Their MD is absolutely a proponent in terms of sustainability. He's, yeah, obviously gone down the sort of biomass, solar, but he's now looking to be completely zero carbon by next year. Including sort of pushing that down as customer suppliers. He talks at a number of events. I don't know if you've come across Richard Hagan, but he, within the small manufacturing world, I think they have 35 employees. He is absolutely green through every pore of his body, I would say, but he talks at a number of events and really is quite a good role model for sort of very small manufacturers, as I say, 35 employees, but yeah, absolutely a passionate individual on the whole area of sustainability.
Well, I'm from Rochdale, but I don't know Richard. I don't know Richard. I haven't lived there for more than half of my life. But
have a look up Crystal Doors and Richard Hagan.
We will.
It was me thinking that was a Langport accent, Chris.
Yeah.
All right. In terms of the grants, you mentioned grants, Chris. Is that something that Auditel can support with in terms of grant applications and things?
Yeah, we can, and that's what we do. I mean, the grants are considerably shifting around at the moment. In fact, a lot of it has been delegated out now from central kind of funds to local funds. So I can send you, Alistair, a link, because some of the members may already have seen some of this. There is a regional grant that is available. It looks like all these things a bit bureaucratic. But it covers a whole range of things. But buried in the description of that says that this grant is available for energy efficiency, sustainability measures. Some of the traditional grants through people like the Carbon Trust are no longer as readily available because they've all been delegated out, etc. Yeah. But there are there, and we do help organisations with that kind of work if it's there. As I say, I think one of the key things, and Dave will back me up on this, is that businesses should not be seeing financing as a barrier to this activity, but unfortunately it does give them a reason to vacillate. I think we see organisations say, well, you know, we won't invest in doing our LED lighting. We'll do it one bulb at a time, which is a really poor economic way of doing things, and it leaves you with a mess further down the line. If you do it as a project, you can get financing for it. It'll pay for itself within a couple of years.
It's interesting you say that, Chris. I remember having a conversation, it must have been 3 years ago, with a company that's specifically fitted LED lighting into large manufacturing premises. And they were saying at the time, you can get this financed and you'll cover the cost of the finance and your savings within 2 years.
Yeah.
And it's a classic kind of no-brainer from a financing point of view, isn't it?
Yeah, I've got two clients that I've despite myself saying this, and one of them is a very local big school who have just proudly announced, well, we're replacing the bulbs as and when they break. And they'll end up with a mishmash of bulbs, different technologies that will, and who knows what kind of quality bulbs they're getting. If you do it as a project, you'll get a solution that meets your needs. And, the costs overall will still work out better than doing it that way. But it's this short-term mentality, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Tim, I'm mindful you haven't got a camera or microphone, so if you do want to put any questions that you've got in the chat, feel free. Steve, was there anything that you had questions on that? I mean, I don't know where you guys are at Pneumatic in terms of your
yeah, okay. Firstly, I have to say that I was quite reassured in that the presentation which Chris gave did mirror quite closely what we're doing and what we're thinking, so much so that during the presentation I texted our sustainability guy to ask if he'd ever spoken to Chris.
I used to have a dialogue with Andrew Smith. I don't know if Andrew's still around, but he was semi-retired then. So
yeah. No, he's still semi-retired, but he is still around. Yeah. Anyway, and I particularly agree with your comment about the issue being for us, the issue being the Scope 3 problem, because we're conscious that no matter how efficient we are on site with building management systems for heating and lighting and renewing old machinery for more efficient new machinery, we're conscious that if we're making vacuum cleaners, then right down the end of the supply chain, there is somebody who is mining aluminium and copper to make the electric motors, and so there's somebody who's drilling and refining oil for the virgin plastics that we still use. And so in terms of our own targets towards net zero, we are conscious that we're relying on all of our suppliers to be on the same path, and so that we can sort of, ride on the coattails to a certain extent of work that our suppliers will be doing. It's not yet got to the point that we are considering changing or selecting suppliers purely based upon sustainability criteria rather than service, supply and price criteria. But we're conscious that we would be relying on suppliers across the world to be all on the same path.
Steve, can I ask a quick question on that one?
Sure.
So Steve, you're saying you're not relying entirely, your words, not relying entirely on sustainability criteria on the procurement side. Do you feature carbon intensity measures at all in your tendering work, in your supply chain?
Not currently, no.
Yeah, because I mean, I think that to start changing the narrative all the way back up the supply chain, I think that's what has to happen. There was a fairly recent Cabinet Office directive that came out around public sector procurement. At the beginning of June, I think they issued it, and essentially it compels all public sector procurement. So anybody who's commissioning. So public sector commissioners, whether that's NHS or schools or whatever, they're being asked to make sure that they question their suppliers and do so most rigorously going forward about the carbon intensity of what they're providing. And I think simply by asking the questions, it starts to make supply chain think in a different way. And when I think back on how things have moved from a regulatory perspective over the years, we started with things like looking at the built environment. We started with things which looked quite innocuous, called energy performance certificates, EPCs, and for many years they were just a requirement to record and report, and gain a certificate. Now those EPCs are becoming quite a weapon. And if you were a landlord today and had a portfolio of tenanted properties, commercial or residential, you're going to be really concerned about this, because you're going to be compelled by a succession of ever tightening pieces of legislation to improve the energy performance of your estate, of your stock. So I'm working with a couple of landed estates at the moment, and they're looking at millions of pounds worth of expenditure to bring their housing stock up to the statutory minimum standards that are being proposed from 2025. So, as I say, I think it's a matter of gradually introducing. Obviously, pneumatic is a large. When you start looking at the entire scope 1 to 3 footprint of the organisation, so it's going to have a large impact. Chris threw up the Microsoft slide, and the percentages on that slide were saying that over 75% of Microsoft's total carbon emissions footprint rests in the supply chain, either upstream or downstream in the use of its product. And that's not unusual. I think that if you're measuring scope 1 and 2, you're probably measuring the tip of the iceberg. The focus is very much increased on what is in that scope 3 and how you discover exactly what your product carbon intensity is, and your activities generally. So I guess I would just urge you to start thinking about, leave price in there, leave performance in there, but start asking the question about carbon performance as well. Start asking about what's the carbon intensity of this product that you're providing into me. And until we start asking those questions and putting the pressure on the supply chain, it's likely to remain a price-based selection process.
I would have expected that the figure for Microsoft would have been higher, because you can't use their products unless you've switched some sort of computer or laptop or phone device on.
Yeah.
And so you can only use the product by generating some sort of power. So I'm surprised that their figure is not higher.
Yeah, well, I mean, I haven't audited their figures, but I think it's just an indication, Steve, that the vast majority is really going to be upstream and downstream of your actual direct activities.
Yes.
So you and yourself, your product is essentially the same. Your in-use consumption is going to involve the consumption of electricity.
Apart from the janitorial trolleys, which just get pushed.
Yeah. I think a couple of things about that, which is interesting, is one of the customers we're working with at the moment is a computing company. And one of the things they do is they take back computers and refresh them and sell them into the public sector. So they basically take them, clean them out, get rid of all any data and stuff, and sell them on. Now that's a positive thing, because in a way that is stopping stuff going into that would have been chucked away and into landfill. It's a really difficult thing to measure that David and Mark are exercising their minds with at the moment, because that's what they've asked us to do. But it goes to things like pneumatic. It's the same kind of thing. The stuff that gets sold on, the cost of what happens to that in the end eventually is going to start becoming your responsibility. It's not just about the fact that when it's on, it's using energy. It's also going to be about, well, what happens to it at the end of its lifetime? Where does it go? And what is the consequence of that? Can it be recycled? Can the equipment be used for other things? And packaging. The packaging, you put stuff in a box. When one of your Henry Hoover goes out, what happens to that box? So at the moment, you don't really care. It goes to landfill from the customer. But at some point, and in the not too distant future, I understand, you're going to be responsible for the cost of what happens to that packaging. That's going to be a cost to you as a business and to all manufacturers that are packaging stuff up, whether it be plastic, cardboard, or anything. So this is a world that's changing rapidly. And if you're not aware of it, once again, it's all about risk management. Be aware of what these things could be, factor them into your forward thinking. Because if you don't do, you might get caught with your pants down, I think. It's not a very positive message. And just for Mark and David, who may not know, because the rest of us probably will, but pneumatic are Henry Hoover.
Henry vacuum cleaners. I'm just going to see
Steve quiet about saying vacuum cleaners, but he didn't mention that.
Don't say the H word.
Henry's okay. It is a fabulous setting. I mean, it's an amazing place. It's so clean, that site. Very well looked at development.
It wants to be clean. They make vacuum clean.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe. But it's fabulous. A very, very interesting place to go to.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant. Thank you. We've seen, I remember in typical kind of Tesla fashion, the Tesla truck being announced, 4 years ago. And I know that there was one company locally, a company called AbleBox down in Yeovil, who announced that they'd placed orders for 2 of these things. They create packaging, funnily enough. So they're going to be an interesting one. Are you kind of, and we see people like Land Rover pushing towards electric vehicles only beyond, you know, well ahead of the legislated date. What's going to be the biggest push, do you think? Is it going to be consumer pressure, or is it going to be legislation?
I think it's mainly legislation and kind of a bit of kind of PR. So we're seeing a lot of within in the last mile is the terminology, but it's more than that. But within cities in particular, partly because of things like clean air zones. So those costs are adding to the costs of diesel small commercial vehicles. So we're seeing more and more organisations setting their stall out and saying we're going to move to this, and they are moving to that. And the technology is there for those kinds of things. We've seen a lot of reluctance from customers who sort of say, "Ooh, electric vehicles, it's not got the range we want." And I think there's a lot of negativity around that when it's not always true. Particularly they get organised and get the charging point set up properly and the logistics set up properly. That technology is increasing over time, so the size of vehicles that can shift the kind of loads and distances they want is improving. And then they've got the HVO, which can fill that a bit of a gap. And then there is at the top end, there's still a situation where basically the technology really isn't ready for a long haul heavy good vehicle to do via electricity. HVO would do it, and hydrogen technology isn't there yet. But yeah, so smaller fleet, I would say, particularly in cities where people are delivering and they're coming under pressure because they're having to pay for clean air zone charges. And you know, and as the technology improves, I think it'll just filter through and through. On the electric vehicle charging point, that is an issue, because if you want to suddenly shift to a lot of rapid charging points, that's going to increase your need for energy, which means that if you don't have sufficient capacity supplied to your premises, you might have an issue doing that. And vice versa, people like Steve will I don't know if you ever got over the problem, but Steve Pneumatic wanted to put more solar panels on the roof but weren't allowed because the local network operator said they didn't want any more capacity being installed on the network at that point, and therefore despite their ambitions to do that.
We've also got 400 staff as employee vehicles who travel to site, and so we've wanted to put in more electric vehicle charging points, but there's not the capacity for that either.
Yeah, so these are things you might think to yourself, this is what I'm going to do, but then you'll be thwarted because you can't, because the infrastructure doesn't allow. So then what are you going to do about it? Do you pay for an upgrade, you know, which you know, get substation put in or whatever it might be, or do you look down other avenues, offsets or other things to do things? But until you've measured and monitored what you need to do, you can't even have that discussion. So you understand it. And I think that's where the problem comes. Someone might say, right, well, let's do this now. And then all of a sudden they go, oh, heck, you know, all my costs are in vehicle and they're all heavy goods and there's no solution. What do I do? And I've just committed to a climate change commitment saying that we're going to be net zero by 2035. You know, and we're seeing that. We're seeing people coming out with these ambitions, the public sector in particular. They're having to make climate change commitments without any plan.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how all those different solutions move, because they're not moving at the same rate at the moment, are they?
But what there is a huge amount of momentum, which is brilliant. You know, I mean, certainly I'm really embedded in the media, so I probably get an overload of this information. But there is so much going on, so many customers doing this thing. There is a momentum that's happening. The governments are really getting behind it. I believe they are. I know that there's some bit of uncertainty around Boris, etc. But you know, we are seeing governments making these kind of commitments. You know, and it is filtering through. It's filtering through into legislation. Real things are happening. I have conversations, as you know, Alistair, about, as I have done with members of the chamber in the past. And I've started talking about cost management. You see people's eyes glazing over because they're not interested really in it, and they think they can do a better job than we can do. and it's trying to convince them, a difficult discussion to try and get them to do that. If you shift the conversation to carbon management, all of a sudden their eyes light up, because this is something that's on their mind, and this is something that they know they're going to have to start taking seriously. So the decision or the discussion changes and becomes a much more positive discussion, because they're not on the defensive about whether or not they're paying too much for something, and they don't want to be, you know, kind of shown to be doing that. It is about something that's real.
Positive conversation, isn't it?
A very positive conversation, which is why we kind of, you know, are keen to sort of try to say, you know, look, we're happy to help with you. The kind of idea of a workshop would be a little bit along these lines of what we've done today, but in more detail, more debate, more kind of flushing out and helping them build that kind of strategy. And then, you know, we can leave them with a decision to make then as to whether or not they would like to engage us to help them go down that journey, or they think they can do it themselves, or they're not going to bother doing it, in which case, well, that's up to them. But Sarah, your view on that? Do you think businesses should be taking this seriously now or not?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think sort of spending it again, my focus is with small manufacturers is often, and certainly some of the services we offer them, you know, it's all about, oh yeah, we can do that another day, another time, you know, we've got our priorities now, we've got these jobs coming in. So I think it's small steps, and you know, you've got to have a plan, and you've got to know where you're starting from, the measurement piece, which I think is really key. But I think particularly small manufacturers, they need that outside help from other organizations and experts to get them started.
And even if you just start off with that first carbon footprint assessment, you at least you've got that in your back pocket. If you get asked suddenly out of the blue, you know what it is. And if you know what it is, you can also start thinking, well, you know, which direction am I likely to be going? Do I need to be improving my infrastructure on a site? Or do I need to be looking at my fleet? Or is it about behavior? Maybe, you know, it could be about people just simply remembering to turn things off better. Is it about investment in equipment? You know, at least you kind of know that. If you haven't done that piece of work, then you'll be on the back foot when you suddenly need to do it. So, you know, we would certainly be saying, get that in, you know, started sooner rather than later, so that you are informed and you can put your plan together.
I think that's your first step. I think that would be an interesting. Okay, Chris, thank you very much. Really interesting discussion as well. So thank you. Just very quickly, from a Chamber's point of view, we're seeing a lot of pressure on businesses with staffing at the moment. Obviously, Steve, as a larger manufacturer, you're probably being affected by people isolating, I take it, at the moment.
No, the isolation numbers are actually quite low at the moment.
Good, okay.
The bigger problem is filling the gaps in the vacancies list.
Yeah, okay. So staffing is the other thing that I wanted to talk about. So you're seeing significant pressure on, I guess, manufacturing staff, are you?
Yeah, so we've been busy. I guess that COVID has possibly indirectly been an assistance to a company that makes cleaning equipment. And as of today, we've probably got about 150 more staff than we had this time last year.
Really?
But we've still got 40 or 50 vacancies.
Okay. Tim has put something in the comments. We're beginning to see our clients introduce to us the software platforms they want us to use to record our carbon input. I hope they get together to find a common one. Yeah. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah.
One piece of software or one reporting platform would be amazing. Yeah, absolutely.
We have a lot to say on this, not surprisingly, but I'll keep it pithy. There are loads of platforms out there, lots of them, and some of them do some really good stuff. Depends on what you need from the platform, but you know, it's a garbage in, garbage out thing. You need to be incredibly careful how you enter the data into that. Some of these platforms pertain to pull data out of financial software tools. And we know that data isn't necessarily in the right format or capture the right information to accurately record these things. So everyone's looking for a quick win on this. We want to make it really easy. We want to put a couple of numbers into a thing and we get a number out and it's all happy. When that number is audited from a proper verifying point of view, it could easily fall over. So you need to be very careful when looking at these tools. We would prefer, I think, generally to do a bespoke calculation, taking into account all the information, does exactly the same thing, but it allows us to do the analysis on the data as it's going in to make sure it's right. Whereas if you just sort of dropping numbers in yourself and you don't know quite what you're putting in, particularly around vehicles, lots of different conversion factors, you could be doing it wrong. And clients we know who have tried to do this themselves have always fallen over and come to us to say, can you help us do this, please?
So that's something you could support on, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, good. I am very mindful of time. I'd like to say a massive thank you to Chris and to David and to Mark from Auditel. Very, very interesting. Really interesting to see how the pressures are increasing on businesses and what businesses can do to mitigate the risks. I agree with you, Chris. It is a risk management thing. If there's one thing over the last year that I think businesses have hopefully got their heads around a bit better, is risk management, maybe. We will put this recording onto our YouTube channel, won't we, Laura?
And I'll send the link out as well in the...
Yeah, and send it out. If you can send out that link for grants, Chris, we'll make sure that's included. And I think we can probably put this onto social media as well, because I think there are actually quite a lot of businesses that can start to consider their carbon footprint. Chris, I think it's probably worth us having a conversation about that. You know, how to calculate your carbon footprint might be quite a nice way of getting businesses really thinking about this as a workshop. I think that would be a good thing to do. So I'll just say thank you very much. Again, thank you all for being here, and hopefully see you all again very soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
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 Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.